Your elections are well run, and they are not generally any, there is a lot of variation, but in terms of the people who are in the office, they take their job so seriously. They are secure, and they follow rules, and they are well administered. And full stop, there is no qualifier needed.
What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
This episode was recorded before Hurricane Milton made landfall in Florida. Discussions about the hurricane may not be up to date.
Welcome to episode 14. We're now less than 1 month away from the election. Believe it or not, it's going to be over soon. I'm Kirby Goodell. I'm here with my co-conspirator, Todd Kent. And today we're very pleased and honored to have with us Soren Jordan. Soren got your PhD from Texas A&M in 2017?
2015.
2015, yeah. Wow. And you've been at Auburn University doing lots of really cool stuff. I think of you maybe first and foremost as a political methodologist. I don't know whether you would agree with that characterization, but I also, think of your work on representation in American politics, your work with election, your work on polarization. I mean, you've got a really cool resume that touches on lots of things, including universal basic income, cryptocurrency, the Supreme Court, trust, really fantastic lots of work that you're doing. Is that a fair description of your work?
I think it's absolutely a fair description. I was somewhat fortunate in grad school to start studying party conflict before it really started to take off. And in the last 15 years or so, it feels like there's nothing in American politics that's not touched by the competition between Republicans and Democrats. And it started with sort of basic stuff like congressional procedures and bills that people were working on, and then now it's propagated into conflict over election administration, like you mentioned, even novel policy agenda items that nobody really talks about, like universal basic income or cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. So it's really fun to study how Republicans and Democrats really compete over narratives around those policies, and obviously how the American public responds, because the response has been intense in the last 5 or 10 years in particular, I think it's fair to say.
Well, what I hear you say is the more you study polarization, the more polarized we become?
That's it. I am the first mover, maybe. That's what a horrible thing to be responsible for.
Yeah. Well, so the way we set up the show is we start off with some quick bites, and we just talk about some things that we're observing in the world, and some things that maybe people aren't paying quite as much attention to, or maybe that our insight as political scientists give us a different way of looking at the problem. And so with that, we'll hit on our quick bites, and I'm going to turn it over to Todd to hit on the first one.
Well, I think there's nothing more kind of prevalent right now than hurricane politics. We've got the previous Helene that went through and really was destructive all up the kind of in the east, but we have a new hurricane coming, and so we see both parties talking about response and what we're doing. And so I think the hurricane plays into the election.
Yeah, and one of the things that we saw are part of the past that we saw is during the Bush administration. Bush was doing pretty well through Katrina, and then the poor federal government response during Katrina helped to turn around his political fortunes and really reshaped his presidency in lots of ways. Are we looking at that right now? Soren, do you have a...
I think so. There's two things to keep in mind. The first is a lot of the American public obviously has very firm ideas of what they think about Republicans and Democrats at this point. But this is an interesting opportunity to shape a narrative this close to the election about a Harris administration. Even though, just a reminder, Joe Biden is still president, but a Harris quote unquote administration who's responding in a particular way that people aren't satisfied with, versus a Republican sort of trying to shape that narrative as, ironically, how much federal government responsibility is there for natural disasters and local versus national level response. And also just remember, North Carolina is a swing state, and these people are going to expect to vote here in less than 30 days. And understanding what the election administration kind of response is going to be a big window for understanding how this particular state is going to fit into the U.S. presidential election here in about a month.
Yeah, right away I start to feel like a bad person because you see a hurricane forming in the Gulf, and my first thought is if it hits Georgia, and Georgia was decided by 10,000 votes in the last election, I didn't imagine the devastation in North Carolina, but North Carolina is a potential swing state in all sorts of ways that it matters. It matters in terms of how the federal government is perceived, in terms of whether they're doing a good job or a poor job, but also in terms of the areas affected and how they'll hold elections in a month.
What's really, I think, also interesting to think about is how you have players in this whole game who are not necessarily a part of the campaign. For example, Joe Biden saying, "Oh, the people are happy; they've gotten what they need, and they're happy." Or Mayorkas saying, "We're kind of running out of money." So those are not part of the campaign, but they could affect perceptions of competence when it comes to a candidate. And so I think there's a lot going on here. And now that we have a new hurricane forming in the Gulf, I mean, this is just going to intensify.
Does it change y'all's perspective at all that this one's largely seen to be tracking towards Florida in particular, maybe not as much of a swing state coming for the presidential election?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now my thoughts are first and foremost on how it affects politics in Georgia and North Carolina and Florida secondarily. But I do think the other pieces of this really matter. How competent is the federal government response, and does it appear that the Biden administration is effectively addressing the crisis? So.
Yeah, there was some politics yesterday talking about. The Harris campaign said they reached out to Florida governor and he wouldn't take the call, and he said no, that wasn't true. They just left a message, So I think we're going to see some electoral politics and some administration politics being played out in Florida. And Florida has gotten very good at responding to storms, so it's not a surprise to them. I think this goes back. You talked about George W. Bush struggling with Katrina, and I think after that, his brother Jeb Bush, as governor of Florida, actually put things in place so they're really great at staging help before the hurricane even hits, and so you're going to see it's not a surprise to Florida.
Yeah, and the other interesting piece of this is FEMA is one of those administrations that tends to not be very well funded. It tends to be a place where you put political appointees rather than political professionals. It's sort of when you're teaching Congress, it's one of those, and there are these types of agencies out there that serve this particular role. But when they're needed, they're really needed. And then the other part of it is it's hard to get disaster response exactly right, because if you're overly aggressive and you get money to people very quickly, you open yourself up to questions of fraud and abuse and people getting money who didn't deserve it and didn't need it. And if you are slow, you look incompetent.
It's one of those places where it's hard to do right if you're FEMA. It's hard to respond at the correct scale. It's hard to respond with enough efficiency and quickly enough in some basic time frame kind of sense. But also, if you're the organization, you don't get much political credit for planning in advance. People don't look at 10-year spending horizons and things like winterization of electoral systems as big, large-scale political victories. In some sense, the only real political opportunity is the immediate response that you have on the ground. And once that has withered away a little bit, there's still people who need help, but there's not as much political gain to be made. And so you see some of that kind of get drifted off a little bit. And that's where FEMA, largely as an agency, it feels like they catch a lot of that blame because they're the ones in that ongoing sense in an institutional capacity. And it's hard to get that level of response correct each time.
If you thinking about the current political state and how polarized it is, does perceptions of competence, is it really matter? Is it going to matter in this election, or is it just something that we're going to get through over the next week or two with the hurricanes? But does competence matter?
I think it does, but I also think it's heavily polarized, right? So I think if you ask, is Trump competent? I think Democrats would say absolutely not. If you said, is Harris competent? I think Republicans would say absolutely not, but Democrats would say yes. And in some ways they are differently competent. are differently incompetent,
I
whichever
guess,
one you prefer there.
I guess what I'm getting at is how well it's perceived that the government responds to these hurricanes. Is that going to play in this idea of competence, or are people has already locked into their vote and it doesn't matter?
I think it's fair to say that most people probably know. Maybe you'll move some people at the margins in the center, but there's a twofold problem. There's not that many people to move at the margins in the center. And then look at the historical litany of things that people are shown to care about in presidential election cycles, according to political science research. Disaster response is not at the top of that list. The things that people have said time and again, especially through this election cycle, it's always the economy, and this time it's also immigration, somewhat in a second, possibly even first place to the economy in this particular election. The thing that's important, like Kirby said, is it's always perception, though. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily actual response. It's not even necessarily what the government's actually doing. It's your perception that's very much shaped by who you're listening to and the kinds of media that you're consuming that's actually going to inform how you think about the administration as a response to these things.
One thing that I've been really locked in on lately, because I'm a little bit surprised for it, not entirely surprised by it, but we're talking about FEMA and underfunding an agency, and both proposals, if we look at the Harris and the Trump proposals going forward in terms of government programs, are going to vastly increase government debt. Trump more so than Harris, according to the projections. I mean, a lot of that depends on what we think is going to happen with the economy. But nobody is talking about debt. It's just off the table. It's about what the different administrations will be spending on. And that seems very different to me.
No, in my lifetime, I remember when people would campaign on the fact that they were going to reduce the deficit.
Yes.
And now we don't hear any talk about that. It's what basically they're the campaign on what I'm going to do for you, even though it may cost a lot of money.
It wasn't that long ago. There was a budget surplus in the short term, and those days are clearly gone. I think I read that it's sometime in the next 5 years we'll hit debt as 100% of GDP, which hasn't happened since World War II. It is a different world, I think, politically speaking. I think most politicians, especially inside of Congress, know that the only real ways to tackle any sort of debt is reductions in spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and those are all just hot button off the table, especially for elected members.
Yeah.
So they're non-starters for a president as a leader of a party, so you get sort of these things at the margin that I think people are interested in what sounds good, like eliminating income tax on tips. And like, this is not for what reason would that have been a political issue 6 months ago? And it's just because I think it sounds good and it plays well to some particular part of a base.
Yeah, and in a particular place in the country too, right? So the appeal is twofold there. Yeah, yeah. So, but the other things going on during this week, lots of different stuff going on. Well, we had a vice presidential debate that seems like maybe it didn't matter a whole lot, but we also had the unsealing of the indictment, which seems like it might be a big deal, but I don't think it probably is.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if Trump's numbers were to drop at all.
Yeah.
So I think once you've been indicted a bunch of times, it becomes where it doesn't seem to be as biting as the first one. So I think that was happened, and then we've hardly heard anything, especially with the hurricane coming. It's not even going to be on the top of the news cycle.
It's a fascinating legal issue, I think, because with the court decision that the presidents were immune to prosecution for their official acts, and then the response from the special prosecutor coming back and saying, well, these weren't official acts; these are private acts. These should this should move forward. It's kind of fascinating as a legal issue. I'm not sure what it does politically.
I was actually fascinated by both these things, which are, of course, not going to be effectual to the outcome of the presidential election. So apologies to our two vice presidential candidates. But the decorum of the VTB debate was, it harkened back to like 2008, 2012 in a way that was kind of pleasant. Maybe for a studier of polarization was especially pleasant to see, but you could see why that kind of staid, calm presence for an hour and a half kind of bores people. And seeing that again, reminds you of why there was, I think, a space for somebody who's a more I don't know how to describe it, but just less staid politician, more just kind of off the cuff like Trump was in 2016, like how he disrupted that kind of civility that we simultaneously yearn for but get kind of bored by. But then with the Trump indictment, the more fascinating thing to me was it was actually covered. I think the Dominion lawsuit in 2020 like really showed news media that like you don't have the ability to blatantly ignore things that happen or to shape just total falsehoods about them if things happen and they're found in federal court. Like Fox News carried the indictment sort of as it unfolded and as it was unsealed. And I was, for one, pretty shocked to see that because usually they avoid that kind of coverage. But I think most news outlets sort of learned that there are repercussions for saying things that are either patently untrue or have the sort of like that element to them. And the coverage has gotten, if not robust, at least more neutral with respect to like some just kind of basic facts that are happening.
Yeah.
You're thinking about the vice presidential debate. It seems to me like that J.D. Vance was probably the big winner. Not just in what happened at the debate, but just going forward, our people's perceptions of him probably changed. He seemed like a civil guy. He didn't seem weird or evil. He came through. So maybe not for this election, but years down the road, it may have changed. Also, I think it's historically the vice presidential debate doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In the election, nobody's going to win or lose based on that. Certainly, it seemed like Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, probably was out of his element a little bit.
Yeah, well, I thought though, so one thing I would agree with you, stylistically, Vance was great. I think he came in with a strategy that was really, really smart. I think Walz was expecting to come in and, just try to go after him super aggressively. And Vance came in and said, no, we're going to do a civil, nice conversation. I'm going to connect with you on a personal level. And I think that unquestionably threw Walz, who was prepared for some, fire breathing, and it didn't happen. And so I agree. Among the sort of winners, J.D. Vance wins because he's made some mistakes out on the campaign trail. There have been times where you wondered whether Trump made a bad pick. But in this moment, he was up to the occasion. He looked presidential. He understood how to be in front of the camera.
Where a camera even was.
Yeah, he was great. I mean, joking about it. Wow, he's got really blue eyes. And Walt seems a little unprepared. Now, I thought as the debate went on, though, in fairness to Walt, I think he kind of got his feet back under him, and he hit a few. He had a few nice points, especially at the end about January 6th, and but I would agree the big winner of that was J.D. Vance.
It was interesting to me. His training as a lawyer probably really came important.
Yeah.
He would get a question, he would frame the question, make his argument,
Yeah.
and then do a closing every time. And so it was kind of like a mini trial, and it was very effective.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe going forward, some other candidates could learn from that.
Yeah, and I think we saw in those moments the reason why people really wanted him as VP, because he was making Trump arguments in a more effective way than Trump could make those arguments, because he was doing it in this calm, dispassionate, smart way, as opposed to just sort of off the cuff reelings.
I think he maybe has realized that only Trump can be Trump, and that's something a lot of other Republicans have tried and emulated and failed ultimately. So maybe I like your perspective of making Trump-style arguments in a way that's digestible, maybe fair to say fairly coherent, fairly short. There's not a lot to follow, and pleasantly just kind of talking as he did it. And especially if you're somebody who maybe, I don't know if any undecided voters possibly tune into VP debates, but if you're somebody who at least hadn't heard that much about J.D. Vance, except for that, like, I don't know how I feel about this guy, what you saw was somebody who was pretty polished, pretty put together, and fairly reasonable by any decorum kind of basis. You could disagree with policy, as many people probably would on either side of the aisle, but presentation-wise, you saw somebody who was very up to task in terms of turning the American public on to a particular vision of what that kind of candidate was, what he wanted to look like.
Yeah. And sort of the last thing before we go to a break, Kamala Harris on 60 Minutes. She has not really done a lot of interviews. She looks like she's about to try to do more and to move into a media blitz to go into the home stretch of this campaign. But she's set for 60 Minutes. Donald Trump decided not to do it. 60 Minutes was hoping for this. We're going to have Harris and we're going to have Trump, and this is going to be sort of the closing arguments of the campaign. But Trump decided not to do it, which Harris also pushed on. But interesting that she is now sort of picking her shots in terms of media appearances, where before she was staying away from those uncontrolled interviews.
And I think it's interesting to think about why is she doing that. I mean, she's certainly chosen what we say friendly media.
Yeah.
People that are going to, and not really the rough media. But does she feel a need to do that given the state of her campaign, or is this a calculated kind of step in where we are in the campaign? So, because I really believe that candidates act as if they're winning or losing. We can try to tell by what they do, where they show up.
Yeah,
And she went to the border for the first time.
Yeah.
She went to North Carolina for the first. So there's taking steps, and so I'm guessing that they're feeling a little bit of heat that she hadn't done that before.
Yeah.
I think it's probably reasonable to say, part of me, in looking purely analytically, I think as a political scientist, if based off what we said earlier, there's probably few undecided voters, lots of impressions of interviews like this, I think are maybe operating at the margins, but are highly unlikely to move a very focused issue-based, even undecided voter who is just thinking about the economy or specific, like, from that perspective, it doesn't make a sense to do a lot of, because it's just potential to say something wrong, do something wrong, provide fodder for the other side. I think maybe she's motivated by some sort of altruistic sense of civic duty. This is what a politician for president is supposed to do: is show up and stand in front of the American public and make decided statements about what their campaign or what their policy would look like. So there is a possibility that, I'd like to excuse my political scientist brain sometimes and say this is the way democracy is supposed to work. Right? You're supposed to have candidates.
Maybe they're not all calculating and thinking about the who's winning and who's
why
losing.
is she doing
like
60
we are.
minutes? I mean, she wants to be president. Like there could be, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's certainly a nice. It's a good thing to do, just sort of normatively speaking, for the health of like where and when we want our candidates to come and talk to us about what they would actually do.
Yeah. See, I'm still stuck on the. She went on and she's like, "I have a Glock and I will shoot you," and also about her positions. When they ask about some of her position shifts, she said, "Well, I've been around and I'm talking to people, and I've got to find places where we can find common ground." I think she's very interestingly trying to play to those middle. Median voters, independent voters, instead of just playing to her base, which is obviously the Trump strategy of playing to his base.
Sure.
So. Well, we're out of time for this segment. So when we come back, we're going to take a deep dive into election administration, which is something our guest, Soren Jordan, knows a great deal about.
Looking forward to it.
Great question. That is a great question.
And that's a great question.
Wow, that's another great question.
That's a great question.
Oh, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
What a great question.
On Fresh Air, you'll hear unexpected questions and unexpected answers.
Weeknights at 6 on KAMU FM.
Howdy everybody, Chet Garner here to let you know about a new series created right here in the Lone Star State to celebrate the spirit, the talent, and the stories that are made in Texas. So join us as we dive into a vibrant world of Texas filmmakers where creativity knows no bounds and every story has a unique flavor. So don't miss Made in Texas, coming soon to your favorite Texas PBS station.
Welcome back. We're ready to talk a little bit about how our elections are run and who runs them, and we have an expert with us. Soren Jordan has been working with when you were at Auburn University, you worked with the election center, and I know you trained election officials. What does that mean? These people are trained?
Sure. Oh, absolutely they are. So I'll start by saying the election center as an entity is, imagine like a trade association for elections officials. So its official name is the National Association of Elections Officials. And so it draws membership from all 50 states as well as U.S. territories from a variety of different levels. So we're talking people on like the Secretary of State side, so the legislative side, the implementation side, as well as actual election administrators. So your county clerks, your probate judges, your poll workers, a variety of people are members of this association that has a training program, which is the Certificate in Election Administration. It's composed of 12 different courses, and that's where Auburn faculty are invited to interact with elections officials, provide them training on a myriad of topics, some of them fairly politically science-oriented, like voting behavior, some of the things we've talked about already, and some of them like history-oriented in terms of the history of elections and how that history plays into the administration of elections today. But I think as to this date, there's been over 1,000 graduates of the election administration, the training program that they have over the course of the last 20 years. Each of those individuals is highly qualified to run and administer elections, not just from a practical sense, but I think more importantly for voters from a like imbued with civic duty and the importance of elections kind of a sense. So I can promise you, your local elections officials are people who care deeply about the way your elections are run, the fact that they're run with integrity, as well as your personal ability to cast a ballot according to your state-specific election rules. Where we run into a lot of problems is that those rules vary a lot from state to state, and people, I think, expect there to be more uniformity. Even if they don't expect uniformity, they assume that there is a right way to run elections, and it's my way and my state's way. And so I don't understand how Oregon does it, but they should do it the Texas way. And of course, people in Oregon feel the exact same looking at us. But that sort of richness, I think, makes elections interesting from a political science perspective. But they really show the importance of a common certification kind of training that the Election Center provides across elections officials, regardless of where they work.
And these are people from everywhere, right? You're not just, when you were at Auburn, you weren't just training election officials in Auburn. They're coming from Texas, from New York, from all over the country.
Absolutely. So I've had the pleasure of interacting with somebody from every single U.S. state, as well as from each of the American territories where we have federal elections. So Guam, each of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I can say this very sincerely, every single person I've met through the Election Center, I have never met somebody who fits the characteristic profile of somebody who I think, the misinformation about elections is trying to build up somebody who's cavalier about elections, somebody who's, working on slipping in ballots on the back end or turning off computers or on at night, whatever it is. That is not what these people do. They are intense public servants who I think, in the truest sense of George H.W.'s quotes, believe that public service is a noble calling, and that the most noble of that calling is service to elections and the service of democracy.
So I've always joked with my students that, especially right after 2020, that like maybe the election, maybe there's some way you could figure this out, but it's much harder than you think. And also, it's much harder today than it had. If you go back to the 1960s, you go back to the 1950s, back to the, quote, good old days, it would have been much easier to try to steal an election than it is in 2024.
That's one of my favorite classes that's in this training program is like the history of U.S. elections, but it spans the gamut, the 1700s, like old colonial history. People were everybody was drunk all the time as I'm through. So my favorite recipe for an election day punch measures alcohol in gallons, which is when it's going to be a fun election day. But there was constant challenges on voter qualification, like in person. And so you would have essentially like a county sheriff adjudicating all of it. You think about that from an administrative standpoint, that is how you steal an election, is almost through brute force, politically savvy, like knowing who that official is and sort of operating at the margins. Whereas today, there are county sheriffs and they're involved in elections, but they are not administrators. Your elections administrators are a full-time professional class of people who do nothing but think about elections 24/7. They follow rules issued to them by the state legislature. There are no more ballot stuffer boxes that have false bottoms. They are intensely focused on making making sure that each person's vote counts, that each person who is eligible becomes registered, and that if you cast a ballot, that vote is counted according to your state's election laws.
So, and that's good. That's really great news. More training, I think, across the states is a great thing for elections. But what we've seen in our elections over the last few years is this kind of questioning whether or not actually states are following their own rules. For example, if you have a mail-in ballot that requires 2 signatures and somebody finds one ballot that only had 1 signature, then it opens it up to, hey, wait a minute, there's questions here. And I read where the Trump campaign has said they have trained 200,000 poll watchers to kind of help. Good idea, bad idea? Is that?
So I actually think the other side of what I do as a political scientist is research parties. So you can't remove partisanship from American politics. I think the best that you can do is thoroughly convince people that are partisan, not that their party's not there, but instead that their party is there, and they are monitoring in a bipartisan way with people from the other side. So in elections that have partisan poll watchers, they are both Democrats and Republicans. So it is a bipartisan way of approaching not the surveillance, but just the operation of elections. I think if you're Republican, it makes you feel better to have Republicans there. If you're Democrat, it makes you feel better to have Democrats there. And in many states, those poll watchers are explicitly partisan, but they come from both sides, and they do feel like they give the average member of the public a sense of confidence in elections that doesn't just come from the way they're administered, but from a watchdog that, unlike a neutral third party, there is no better, and our framers understood this best when they said ambition must counteract ambition. There is no better check to a Republican ambition at the poll than a Democrat watcher to make sure that they follow the rules. And in that sense, I think partisans, in implementing this idea of a poll watcher, figured that out a long time ago.
It's interesting to see during this current election cycle kind of a back to the future, where you say, we're gonna go back to paper ballots, and these type of things. What do you see? What do you think the future of election administration is going to be?
The answer to that question has changed so much, because if you look at polls, not just of elections officials, but of the American public, they all thought that by 2030 we're going to be voting from our phones. Like, there's no way this thing called the internet is going to slow down the progress of technology. And obviously, in the last 5 years, what you've seen is a huge pushback to elections are things that are better with a paper trail. We want something to be able to, and I'll use the joking term, forensically audit, because nobody knows what a forensic audit actually is, but that's what everybody wants.
Yeah.
Having that separate standalone record, even if you vote digitally, most of those ballot devices create a paper record that you can then audit after the election, and that standby helps people feel a lot better about election administration. So I think there is like an upper limit to the amount of technology that people are willing to tolerate. The thing that will also continue to change, I feel very confident about this, is your elections administrators will continue to become more professional. A higher percentage of them have college degrees than they ever have before. A higher percentage of them are graduates of programs like the Election Center's training program for election administrators, and a greater percentage of them are also just full-time. So all they think about is elections and the administration of elections. And that, I think, hopefully should make everybody feel much more confident in how elections are run.
And yet, if we look at some polling data, I pulled a poll, 58% of Americans say they are concerned or very concerned about voter fraud and election security. And then, of course, there are very strong partisan differences, 86% of Republicans, 33% of Democrats. And I know this varies a lot depending on question wording, but the idea that there are significant concerns about the security of elections, it's still there, right?
Of course it is. I always like to remind ourselves of two things. The first is a lot of this is colored by the winner. So people get concerned when they lose. Democrats were very concerned about the integrity of elections in 2016 after Trump won. And there was sort of the question of election interference from Russia at that time. But you see the poll numbers were almost totally flipped in the sense of which party it was that was concerned. And there's nothing to to deflate those concerns quite like winning does. So you see more Republican scrutiny of elections. Of course, if Trump were to win in 2024, I think you would see all of that just completely disappear, and all of a sudden we would have the most secure elections in the world again, just because the partisan sort of lens coloring it would be different. But I think the other thing that's true is this echoes a very true fact about politics more generally, which is people trust what's close to them. People have very little trust in the federal government. People hate Congress, which is fun to just tell people as a political scientist, but people like their local congressperson. People like their city council. People like their county government. And in that very same sense, when you ask people a trio of questions, do you trust elections at the national level, at the federal level, or the state level, and then finally at the local level, and do you trust that your vote will be counted, quote, as intended at those levels, trust at the local level, even across both parties, is above like 60 or 70% thresholds, because again, they may look at mail-in ballots that they don't understand in a place like Oregon, but see in person, and even the early vote each state has its own proclivities, and they trust those proclivities as they've been allowed to evolve over the course of time, which helps them see that, like, I don't know how I feel about elections over there, but here they're fine, and they will continue to be fine.
Yeah, and so the other thing that I've sometimes joked with my classes with is, and especially after 2020, it's not the things that are actually wrong, are illegal, are not allowed. Now, there was some relaxing of the rules in 2020 that I think gave some legs to some of the concerns about whether the election was fair, because we were during a pandemic and we wanted people to vote, and so there were some issues along those lines. But the bigger challenge is explaining to people why, it differs everywhere. Right? Every state has their own set of rules, and those rules are different, and you have to explain to people, no, voting isn't this national thing. We don't have a national standard. We don't have a national set of rules. How we count the ballots, how we actually go and vote, how we register, how the registration rolls are maintained, all that differs state to state, which is great for us, right? Because we love it. But when you try to explain to people, well, no, that's not how they do it in Nebraska.
Yeah, and it's one of my favorite parts of political science, because it integrates so many things that we care about. It integrates American political history, American concepts that are unique, I think, of federalism, as well as the distinct things that your framers in the Constitution placed a special emphasis on. And one of the things that was highly localized going back to 1787 was the election experience. People were used to voting in they liked voting because it was different from the UK experience, but it was also something that, elections were like town hall meetings. It was this highly localized affair, and I think the spirit of how people trusted elections as a result of that propagated into the Constitution. Article 1, Section 5, it is the elections clause, the elections clause says the time and place of their choosing belongs to the states, and so states have richly developed a tapestry of very different election laws, because I like to think they know what works best, both pragmatically, practically, as well as culturally for the residents of that state. People in Oregon may feel, I keep using Oregon because it was the first state to adopt vote by mail, but the West had a different experience with respect to voting. It was earlier expansion of the franchise to women than was federally by constitutional amendment, so you had higher expectations for what voting would look like. Whereas, in the South, I came from a state in Alabama that had no early voting whatsoever. It was election day voting from 7 to 7, and that was it. Because the expectation was, this is just how we do things here. And if you want to vote, then you should do so on election day. But comparing those different feelings and the different cultures, I think, of those states allows those states to respond in a way that helps them develop policy that reflects what the people who live there, what they would expect out of state policy in order to trust elections. And I keep saying state policy because you said something important, which is, 2020 offered an expansion of the rules that some people felt comfortable with. And I always remind people, that is not local election administrator changing rules. That is state legislators saying, for this election or in our state, this is what the early voting period, if there is one, looks like. This is what felon enfranchisement, if there is any, looks like. This is what in-person voting looks like. This is what mail-in balloting looks like. And if you dislike those rules, your issue is not with the local election official. Your issue is with the person who's actually writing your laws. So, find their cell phone number and just start texting them how much you care about elections.
Do you think that kind of the election industry has been their own worst they've opened themselves up to scrutiny. Let me give you an example. I was in Europe this summer when the European Parliament elections were going on. In every country, the results came out that evening. But in here, we're seeing more and more where the results not really finished for a couple days, and that opens it up to the scrutiny that something's going on. And so the criticism that the election industry is getting, is it some of it their own fault?
So I would push back actually and say we're the problem and media is the problem. The problem is the expectation that they should be there on election night. And you think about it, there's a number of classes of individuals that their ballot will not be counted as intended on election day because it's just canvassed later. For instance, we opened the show talking about hurricane politics. A lot of those individuals will be displaced in about a month. They'll expect to vote by absentee ballot because the State Board of Elections in North Carolina just announced that they'll be expanding access to absentee balloting, which is again a state level decision. In order for those to be counted correctly, some of the new rule will be if you're staying with relatives outside of your county, your vote can be turned into that county in which you reside, which will then be under strict chain of custody, literally under lock and key, will be transported to the county which is going to be counted. That process takes time, especially if the roads are all washed out. So they're not expected to be canvassed until 7 days after the election. Yeah. We have to learn to be fine with that. That on election night, unless there's a landslide of states, there probably won't be a winner announced, and that has to be okay with us.
And we could change, to your earlier point, we could change the rules so that it was easy to figure out who won on election night, but it would require doing things that people wouldn't like. Like you can't have paper ballots and expect them all to be counted on election day.
You certainly can't count them by hand, which is something that people want to do.
Yeah.
But I was like, there's military voters, overseas voters.
Yes.
These are individuals who UOCAVA, which is a piece of federal legislation that helps uniformed officers overseas cast a ballot. Their votes come back in essentially as absentee. And so if you argue that we need to have every single ballot counted by election night, you're essentially arguing to disenfranchise people who are stationed somewhere else.
And if you allow people to inspect those ballots to make sure that they're accurate and to make sure that you have people from both sides inspecting the ballots as they're coming in, you're slowing down the process. So you're both wanting it to be out that night, but you're also putting checks into place that make it harder to count the ballots. And at some level, at some point, you have to decide we can be fast or we can be careful.
Exactly.
Take your pick.
I think the real problem that we find ourselves in, one is the problem of perception, which you just said. The second is the problem of legislators in particular writing rules but not realizing how much time it would take to follow those rules correctly. So the State Board of Elections in Georgia recently announced we're going to do a hand count of the number of ballots cast in each precinct in each county and tabulate that and reconcile it with the total number of votes cast by electronic count. That count is going to take forever. But there will still be an expectation that, especially in Georgia and North Carolina, which two states I mentioned on purpose because they are both swing states and places that will have either by absentee because of a natural disaster or because of following procedure in this hand count, the likelihood that we will know for certain who won those states on election night is very slim. And either we have to shift our perception and say it's okay to not know for a few days while procedure plays out, or to your point, if we don't like that, change the procedure.
I like the voting by phone. Let's vote by phone. We can know right away. We'll know in
American
an hour.
Idol style. I was okay with texting in my vote for Carrie Underwood. I can do it again. But the chief thing that I always want to make sure I emphasize is the person who has no say in these decisions, but is simply an implementer of policy, is the election official. So the rules come from somewhere else. They're simply followed. Yeah. So for those of you who are thinking about hearing this conversation and all of a sudden now it's you're telling me that my tabular is going to do a hand count. Mm-hmm. That's silly. Why are they doing that? There's no they involved. They are told by somebody else, and they are simply following rules.
Yeah. Yeah. But now they do get a lot of pushback, right? Or a lot of, we know political violence in general is a concern. We've seen it 2 assassination attempts now on Donald Trump, but also a lot of people in local settings becoming more likely to threaten violence or to threaten officials. And so these officials, they are professionals, but they are also somewhat at risk.
They absolutely are. And it's one of the few times that I get truly upset as a political scientist because they are the lightning rod for a lot of people's discontent about politics in general and elections specifically. That's why I spend so much time trying to emphasize the role that they play, which is not as a policy originator, but as a policy implementer. Because it's not fair to target, harass, to follow to these people's homes, to post on some social media the names of their children, the schools they attend, each of which are stories that I've heard from real life elections officials that are that feel those things and feel that targeted harassment and wonder, how am I supposed to continue doing a job that I love in service to something that I care deeply about, knowing that I'm putting myself and maybe even my family in some kind of security risk? And I think like there's data from an institute in Princeton that in the 2024 election cycle, the number of those threats has gone up. A lot of it has been, there have been relatively few physical threats or like targeted instances of harassment, which is good, but it is purely unacceptable to see a public servant and to assume that it's just because they're in public service that it's okay to instigate these kinds of things, because they know that they're in the job. They feel that and they respond. And there are worries that we'll lose a lot of the very expertise and professionalism and experience. Like the average election administrator going into 2024 had 15 years of election administration experience. That's a long time on the job to know how presidential elections work on election night and to be nimble in response to things like natural disasters. If you fill that with a bunch of people who've been on the job for 3, 2, 1 year because older election administrators just decided to retire because they didn't want to do it anymore, that's when I think you actually do see the potential for some, not threat to election administration, but the increased possibility for mistake, just because the expertise and the institutional knowledge isn't there in the same way.
Yeah.
So throughout our history, we've seen around elections the federal government step in certain ways. Do you think there'll be a move in the future to not make them all the same, but have some general guidelines that everybody has to follow?
The federal government would love nothing more than to standardize elections across jurisdictions. There's two things that I think keep it from happening. The first is a very strong constitutional argument that the Supreme Court's been pretty fiercely protective of, which is it says pretty close to verbatim that states have very essential prerogative over elections. So the federal government, I think, has made some strides over the standardization of federal election contests. So anytime that there is a presidential nominee or a member of Congress on the ballot, then you see a lot more standardization of like methods of registration. There is a federal postcard that you can fill out to register to vote that is ostensibly something you can submit to any jurisdiction in the United States and contains all the information that you need. The problem is, outside of those federal contests, like why does ranked choice voting exist in so many places? And for local contests, like New York City has ranked choice voting for a variety of things. It's because there is no federal office on the ballot, so there's no federal prerogative to change the way in which those things are administered. But perhaps much more importantly, this is true of both the public and elections administrators. If you ask them, okay, you want to change it to be more uniform, what should the standard be? And the mental image is always my standard. We should all do vote by mail because Colorado's got it and it works great. Or we should have no early voting because Alabama doesn't have it and it works great. There is, I think, and you've seen this before, like last presidential election cycle where there was a big push to strengthen American elections with H.R. 1, John Lewis's namesake bill, and it ultimately went nowhere because I think you can't agree on the kinds of things that even if there was a constitutional ability for a federal standard, what that standard would look like. Leaving the main thing the federal government does is just spend money. In the aftermath of Bush v. Gore, which I think brought to a point a lot of different election administration styles and technology in a way that focused a problem, which is you can't have machines that have punch cards and hanging chads. Federal government, as it does with highway funds and alcohol sales, as it does with a great number of things, if you conform to the standard, we'll pay for it. And that's where you might see changes in technology, adoption of technology in particular, among especially smaller jurisdictions that don't necessarily have a robust budget to pay for it on their own. But in terms of like, are all 50 states going to start sharing lists or doing voter registration 90 days before no, they will not.
But we're getting close to running out of our time. But I do want to get at this question because you're hitting all over it if you were telling a state, if you're advising a state about best practices, what would those practices be? Who's doing it really well? And I guess that's a trick question, because part of it is, what does doing it really well mean? What are we optimizing on the back end?
And I think that's where it's a struggle, and it's kind of fun to be a political scientist. I don't know if there is a universal definition of well. In some sense, there's a democratic definition, which is, are all eligible voters, according to whatever set of rules, able to register and cast a ballot and have it counted? And to the extent that jurisdictions are able to do that and conform with their state level policy, that is doing elections well. I think statewide, I don't know if there's a best set of policies. There are certainly things that work better or worse from an administrative standpoint, but at its core, I think most states recognize that elections are very much a cultural thing, and what works for one place may not work for another. The thing that I would encourage, to the extent that there are any state legislators listening, is the person who you should talk to isn't necessarily your constituents, but it's your local election official. They're the ones who will help you in your particular state's vision and set of rules, help you think through, if I design legislation this way with this set of deadlines, what would happen? Is this a good idea or a bad idea? Are there unintended consequences to changing a deadline or to doing list maintenance within a certain time frame? I think state legislators are experts in getting elected. They may not be experts in elections, but they have access to that expertise, and most elections officials that I talk to are more than willing to share it when asked.
Yeah. So our elections are likely going to be safe and secure, barring some problem we haven't seen. We have professionals on the job. Election administration is generally well done, but lots of variance across the states, and we're not going to know a winner probably by the end of the night unless something happens to radically change the race, because it's just too close and it's going to be too close to call.
Yeah, no, we'll for sure not know a winner. I'm going to quibble, as I should not quibble, and was very clearly a close. Your elections are well run, and they are not generally there is a lot of variation, but in terms of the people who are in the office, they take their job so seriously. They are secure, and they follow rules, and they are well administered. And full stop. There is no qualifier needed.
Well, I hope everyone listens to this, because this is a good message, and people. This is something that I feel like people need to hear. It's something this is our public service announcement, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, that's it for episode 14 of Inside Political Science. Thanks to Soren Jordan. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform, and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.